The metal of my Rolex felt cold. Then it felt wet. I was kneeling in the dirt, staring at my own name carved into a headstone that shouldn't have been there. 10 minutes earlier, I was the CEO of a billion-dollar firm. Now, two men in police uniforms were holding a wire around my throat, and one of them whispered that my wife had already signed my cremation papers. They weren't just killing me. They were erasing me. According to the state of Illinois, I died at 8 a.m. this morning. In exactly 3 hours, my partner Marcus will sign a merger that makes my legal resurrection impossible. If I don't get to the city vault before then, I don't just lose my company, I stay a ghost forever. You think you own your life? You don't. You're just a set of codes in a cloud. And someone just hit delete on mine. Let me take you back to the boardroom, 30 minutes before the world stopped knowing who I was. The mahogany table vibrated under Julian's palms as Marcus Thorne slammed the tablet onto the polished surface. A digital death certificate glared from the screen, cold and clinical. Julian's own name sat beneath the header of the Office of Vital Statistics, stamped with a crimson seal of expiration. The air in the boardroom curdled, smelling of industrial ozone and the faint metallic tang of a cooling HVAC system. CEO Sarah Jenkins recoiled, her silk blouse rustling like dry leaves against the leather of her executive chair. Julian reached for his water glass, but his fingers twitched, sending a ripple across the crystal surface that felt like a localized earthquake. "You're a ghost, Sterling," Marcus spat. His voice lacked its usual gravel, replaced by a sharp, predatory edge that cut through the sterile silence of the room. "This man is a phantom, a con artist wearing a dead man's skin. Look at the ledger. Julian Sterling died of a cardiac event in a motel in Gary 3 days ago. This thing standing before us is an identity thief." Marcus signaled toward the double doors. 2 men in charcoal suits, private security contractors with the thick necks of former linemen, marched inside. Their heavy, rubber-soled shoes thudded against the plush carpet with a sound like muffled drum beats. They smelled of cheap peppermint and sweat. Julian tried to stand, his knees locking, but a hand clamped onto his shoulder like a vice. The grip crushed the padding of his Italian blazer, the heat of the guard's palm seeping through the fabric. "Wait, Sarah." Julian started, his throat tight, the words feeling like sandpaper against his tongue. "This is a fabrication. Marcus is moving on the Hellgate project. He's trying to push me out before the audit. Check the primary records, call the hospital." Sarah wouldn't meet his eyes. She adjusted her glasses, focusing on a loose thread on her sleeve, her face a mask of corporate neutrality. The security guards hauled Julian upward, his heels dragging across the rug, leaving twin furrows in the expensive wool. "Strip his credentials," Marcus commanded, leaning over the table to seize Julian's titanium laptop. He didn't just take it, he reclaimed it, his fingers proprietary and greedy. The security team shoved Julian toward the exit. The hallway light blinded him, smelling of lemon wax and industrial filtered air. Behind him, the heavy oak doors clicked shut, severing the connection to his life's work with a final, muted thud. He stood in the corridor, a breathing man declared a corpse, while the world he built continued to hum behind soundproof glass. The precinct smelled of wet wool, stale coffee, and the sharp, chemical sting of floor cleaner. Julian sat on a hard plastic chair in the corner of a holding room, his wrists chafing against the metal of the table. He had spent the last hour begging for a phone call, but every time an officer passed, they looked at him with a mixture of confusion and disgust. To them, he wasn't a billionaire tech mogul. He was a John Doe caught with a stolen wallet and a delusional story. When the door finally creaked open, Julian felt a surge of hope that tasted like copper in his mouth. Robert Hayes, his personal attorney for a decade, stepped into the room. Robert looked exactly as he always did. Heavy set, blinking behind thick glasses that magnified his eyes into watery orbs. He didn't sit down. He stood near the door, straightening his pens on his legal pad with obsessive precision. "Robert, thank God," Julian breathed, leaning forward. The metal chair groaned under his weight. "You need to pull the original incorporation papers. Marcus is using a forged death certificate from the Indiana branch. I need a judge to issue an emergency stay on my assets. My fingerprints, my DNA, it's all in the system. Just tell them who I am." Robert didn't look up from his pad. He began counting the ceiling tiles, his lips moving silently. 1, 2, 3. He reached 20 and finally stopped, his posture stiffening as if a cold rod had been driven down his spine. "I'm afraid there's a conflict of interest, Julian," Robert said. His voice was a flat monotone, devoid of the warmth they'd shared over 1,000 dinners. "I've been retained by Thorn Industries to oversee the transition of your estate. According to the legal filing, you don't exist. Representing a non-entity would be a violation of my bar ethics." Julian felt the air leave his lungs. "A transition? Robert, I'm sitting right here. Touch me. I'm warm. I'm breathing. Marcus is paying you, isn't he? How much? I'll double it once I get back into my accounts." "Your accounts are frozen, pending probate," Robert said, finally meeting Julian's eyes. The magnification of his glasses made his gaze feel like a microscope. "And Marcus didn't have to pay me much. He simply reminded me of what happens to people who stand in the way of a moving train. You're a ghost, Julian, and ghosts don't have bank accounts." Robert turned to leave, the latch of his briefcase clicking, click, clack, like a death rattle. "An officer will be in shortly to transport you to a county facility for processing. I'd suggest you stop claiming to be Mr. Sterling. It only makes the mental instability clause of the committal easier to prove." The door shut. 10 minutes later, a man in a dark blue uniform entered. He didn't look like the other cops. His eyes were too sharp, his movements too fluid. He carried a heavy bundle of plastic zip ties in his gloved hand. He didn't speak. He just hummed a low, mournful tune that vibrated in Julian's chest. The transport van was a cage of cold steel and shadows. It smelled of old exhaust and the metallic tang of blood. Julian sat on the narrow bench, his hands bound behind his back with plastic strips that bit into his skin every time the van hit a pothole. Across from him sat the officer, who was now ignoring the radio and staring at Julian with a terrifying, blank focus. "We aren't going to the county jail, are we?" Julian asked. His voice was a rasp. The man didn't answer. He reached out and tightened a zip tie around Julian's neck. Not enough to kill him yet, but enough to make every breath a labored, whistling struggle. The plastic was cold against Julian's throat. Julian felt a spark of primal panic, the same feeling he'd had as an 8-year-old watching his father's house being boarded up. He looked down at his wrist. They hadn't taken his watch, a heavy, custom-made gold chronograph. It was a gift from Marcus, ironically. As the van slowed for a turn onto a gravel road, Julian threw his weight forward. He slammed his forehead into the man's nose. There was a sickening crunch, like a dry branch snapping. The man roared, his hands flying to his face. Blood, dark and thick, sprayed across Julian's white shirt. Julian twisted his body, using his bound hands to swing the heavy gold watch like a flail. He caught the man in the temple. The blow sounded like a hammer hitting a melon. The attacker slumped, his eyes rolling back. Julian didn't wait. He lunged for the man's belt, his fingers fumbling with the keys. He found a small, encrypted key card tucked into the man's inner pocket. Not a police ID, but a Thorn Industries executive pass. Julian shoved it into his sock. He kicked the emergency release on the back doors. The cool night air rushed in, smelling of rain and Lake Michigan. The van was still moving, maybe 20 miles an hour. Julian didn't think. He jumped. He hit the pavement and rolled, the asphalt tearing through his suit and skin. He didn't stop to check the damage. He scrambled into the dark alleyways of the West Loop, a dead man running through a city of light. The rain began as a drizzle and turned into a downpour that tasted of soot. Julian stood across the street from his own home, a glass and steel penthouse overlooking the park. The windows were glowing with a warm, amber light that felt like a mockery. He felt the small server blade fragment in his pocket, rubbing it until his thumb felt raw and wet with blood. It was his anchor. He slipped through the service entrance, using a code he hoped Marcus hadn't changed. The elevator ride felt like an ascent to the gallows. When the doors slid open, the scent hit him first. Expensive lilies and wood smoke. It was the smell of his life with Linda. He walked into the living room, his shoes squelching on the hardwood. There, on the velvet sofa, sat Linda. She was wearing a black silk dress, her eyes red-rimmed. Marcus was beside her, his heavy hand resting on her shoulder, his thumb stroking the fabric of her sleeve in a slow, possessive rhythm. "Linda," Julian whispered. She looked up. For a second, her eyes widened, a flicker of recognition dancing in the hazel depths. Julian took a step forward, his hand outstretched, a husband returning from the grave. "Julian?" she breathed. Marcus didn't flinch. He leaned in closer to her ear, his voice a low, hypnotic crawl. "Don't look, darling. It's just another one. The police warned us about the lookalikes. They come out of the woodwork when a man of Julian's stature passes." Linda's face hardened. She looked through Julian as if he were made of glass. She reached into her purse and pulled out a piece of paper, her hands trembling. "My husband is dead," she said, her voice like ice. "I signed the papers this morning. I saw the ashes. You are a monster for coming here. Linda, look at my face. It's me. The scar on my knee from the skiing trip in Aspen. The way you take your coffee with 2 drops of cream. Marcus is doing this." Marcus stood up, his smile never reaching his pale blue eyes. He moved into Julian's personal space, the scent of his expensive cologne, sandalwood and arrogance, cloying in the air. "You should leave, Mr. Sterling," Marcus said. "Before I call the real police. My wife is grieving. She doesn't need a ghost haunting her living room. We're all friends here, aren't we? And friends know when the party is over." Linda turned away, sobbing into her hands. Julian saw the way she straightened her wedding ring, the new one Marcus had bought her, exactly 3 times. The betrayal was a physical weight, a stone in his gut. He realized then that she wasn't a victim. She was a collaborator. She had traded his life for the safety of Marcus's shadow. Julian backed away, retreating into the rain, leaving the only home he had left to the man who had stolen his name. The neon sign of the Lakeview Motor Inn flickered in a sickly green pulse, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the cracked linoleum of the lobby. Julian stood at the counter, his hood pulled low, the smell of stale cigarettes and damp carpet clinging to his lungs. His body ached from the jump out of the van, a dull throb in his ribs that hummed with every heartbeat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a backup credit card he kept for emergencies. A black card tied to a shell company in the Caymans. He'd set it up years ago as a hedge against corporate espionage, a secret lifeline. He slid it across the counter toward the manager. A balding man named David Wilson, who was currently scrubbing a coffee stain with obsessive fury. "One night. Cash is fine if you prefer," Julian said, his voice low. David Wilson stopped scrubbing. He took the card with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated, and swiped it through his ancient terminal. The machine let out a series of high-pitched pings. David's eyes darted to the monitor, then back to Julian. He began washing his hands with a bottle of sanitizer behind the desk. "Is there a problem?" Julian asked, his eyes tracking the door. "Just a moment, sir," David muttered. "The system is lagging." Julian looked over the counter. On the screen, a bright red banner was flashing. "Alert. Terrorist watch list / deceased identity. Contact authorities immediately." Below it was Julian's own face, grainy and distorted, labeled as a high-risk fugitive. The manager's hand moved under the desk, his finger hovering over a silent alarm. Julian didn't wait for the siren. He snatched the card back, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Pop always said, a clean desk is a clean soul," David muttered, his voice shaking. "You shouldn't be here. You're not real." Julian turned and bolted. He burst through the glass doors just as the first wail of a police siren echoed off the surrounding brick buildings. He ran into the rain-slicked alley, his feet splashing through puddles of stagnant water and oil. He could hear the heavy thud of car doors closing and the crackle of police radios behind him. The city he had helped digitize, the smart city he had designed to be efficient and safe, had officially turned into a predatory organism. Every sensor, every camera, every terminal was now a finger pointing at his chest. The alley was a labyrinth of rusted dumpsters and fire escapes. Julian pressed his back against the cold, wet brick, trying to slow his breathing. He pulled the encrypted keycard from his pocket. It felt warm, a piece of stolen power. But as he looked at it in the dim light of a street lamp, he noticed a tiny, pin-sized bump near the corner. He dug his fingernail into the plastic. A small circular chip popped out. A GPS tracker. Marcus hadn't just lost the card. He'd let Julian take it. It was a tether. Julian threw the chip into a passing garbage truck, but he knew it was too late. The cameras at the end of the alley whirred, their lenses adjusting with a soft, mechanical click. He looked up at the smart city nodes mounted on the lampposts. Sleek, white boxes that he had once touted as the future of urban management. Now, they were the eyes of a god that hated him. He saw a parked car, a nondescript sedan with the keys left in the ignition, a stroke of luck that felt too good to be true. He jumped in and floored it, the tires screaming against the wet asphalt. But as he reached the main boulevard, the dashboard lights flickered. The digital display read, "Remote termination initiated." The steering wheel locked. The brakes went soft. The engine died with a final, pathetic wheeze in the middle of a 4-lane intersection. Julian sat in the dead car, the rain drumming on the roof. Realizing that Marcus wasn't just following him. Marcus was playing with the city like a child with a toy set, and Julian was the only piece on the board that wasn't supposed to be there. The roar of an engine drowned out the rain. A black SUV, reinforced with a steel brush guard, accelerated through the intersection. It didn't swerve. It hit Julian's stalled sedan with the force of a wrecking ball. Metal shrieked as the frame buckled, glass exploding inward in a diamond dust spray. Julian's world spun into a blur of gray and black. When the spinning stopped, Julian was pinned. The steering column had crushed his lap, and the driver's side door was crumpled inward, a wall of jagged steel. He smelled gasoline and scorched rubber. A figure emerged from the black SUV. It was Michael Davis, the man with the scarred neck and the rhythmic tap. He didn't rush. He walked with a clinical, predatory gait, his heavy boots crunching on the broken glass. He pulled a handgun from a holster at his hip, his index finger tapping the frame 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Marcus wants the card back," Michael said, his voice a low hum that competed with the rain. "But he didn't say you had to be breathing when I gave it to him." Julian struggled, his fingers clawing at the door handle. It was stuck. Michael raised the pistol, the barrel looking like a dark, bottomless tunnel. Julian reached into the footwell, his hand closing around a heavy metal tire iron he'd seen earlier. With a scream of pure, unadulterated rage, he slammed the iron against the window frame, clearing the remaining glass, and rolled out of the wreckage just as a bullet punched a hole in the headrest. He scrambled toward the entrance of a nearby suburban junkyard, a graveyard of crushed sedans and rusted machinery. He could hear Michael's footsteps behind him, rhythmic, steady, inevitable. Julian dove between 2 stacks of flattened cars, the scent of old oil and stagnant water filling his nose. He was a rat in a maze, and the exterminator was counting his steps. Julian's breath came in ragged, burning gasps. He was deep in the heart of the junkyard, surrounded by towers of compressed steel that looked like the bones of a forgotten civilization. He could hear Michael Davis humming that funeral dirge, the sound bouncing off the metal walls, making it impossible to tell where he was coming from. Julian reached a central clearing. In the middle stood a massive industrial crane equipped with a heavy electromagnet, used for moving the scrap. The control booth was 10 feet up, accessible by a rusted ladder. He climbed, his fingers slipping on the wet rungs. He reached the booth just as Michael stepped into the clearing. Michael didn't look up. He was focused on the ground, tracking the bloody smears Julian's shoes had left. Julian grabbed the heavy iron levers. He'd spent his summers in college working sites like this. He knew the language of heavy machinery. He slammed the power switch. The generator beneath the booth groaned to life, a deep, vibrating thrum that shook Julian's teeth. He swung the crane arm over a pile of loose engine blocks and rusted frames. He lowered the magnet and hit the engage button. There was a violent clack as tons of metal were sucked upward, clinging to the magnet in a jagged, heavy cluster. Michael heard the sound and looked up, his eyes widening. Julian swung the arm with everything he had. He didn't drop the metal on Michael. He dropped it onto Michael's SUV, which was parked at the edge of the clearing. The sound was deafening, a thunderclap of crushing steel. The SUV disappeared under a mountain of scrap. The alarm on the vehicle began to wail, a high-pitched scream that echoed through the junkyard. Michael fired 3 shots at the booth, the bullets sparking off the reinforced glass. But the distraction worked. Julian leapt from the back of the booth onto a pile of tires and scrambled toward the perimeter fence. He didn't look back to see if the hitman was following. He just ran until his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, vanishing into the suburban sprawl where the smart city eyes couldn't see him. The public library was a sanctuary of hushed whispers and the smell of old paper. Julian sat in a back corner, huddled over a flickering computer terminal. His clothes were torn, his skin caked with dried blood and grease. But in the dim light of the library, he looked like just another homeless man seeking warmth. He slid the encrypted keycard into the terminal's reader. He'd used a series of proxy commands he'd written years ago to mask his digital footprint, creating a black hole in the library's network. The files on the card opened with a series of soft clicks. It wasn't just a pass, it was a ledger. A record of every deletion Thorn Industries had performed in the last 6 months. Julian scrolled through the names, his heart freezing. He stopped at a file labeled Sterling_exit_protocol. He opened it. There, in the metadata of his own death certificate, was the digital signature of the person who had filed it. It wasn't Marcus. It wasn't a doctor. Authored by Sarah Johnson, Head of Human Resources. Julian leaned back, the plastic chair creaking. Sarah. She had been with him since the beginning. She was the one who knew where all the bodies were buried because she was the one who had handled the payroll for the security teams. But there was more. Sarah wasn't just HR anymore. According to the internal memos, she had been seconded to the Office of Vital Statistics as a consultant for their new digital cloud migration, the very project Julian's company had won. She was the wolf in the fold. She was sitting in a government office right now, using her admin credentials to manually scrub Julian's life from the federal servers. Every tax return, every property deed, every record of his birth, she was deleting them one by one, like a child erasing a chalkboard. Julian realized he didn't just need to stop Marcus. He needed to stop the erasure at the source. He looked up the address for the Vital Statistics satellite office. It was a secure facility near Navy Pier. "I'm coming for you, Sarah," Julian whispered, his voice a ghost of a threat. He stood up, his legs shaking, and walked out into the cold Chicago night, the weight of the keycard in his pocket feeling like a loaded gun. The satellite office was a brutalist block of concrete and glass, tucked away behind the tourist traps of Navy Pier. It smelled of industrial floor wax and the salt spray of the lake. Julian watched from the shadows of a parking garage as Sarah Johnson stepped out of the side entrance. She looked haggard, her hair tucked and untucked behind her ears, in a frantic, repetitive motion. She was carrying a heavy leather briefcase, clutching it to her chest like a shield. He followed her as she walked toward the pier, weaving through the crowds of tourists and families. The giant Ferris wheel spun in the background, a neon circle of blue and gold that made the world feel dizzy and unstable. He caught up to her near the edge of the pier, where the sound of the waves hitting the pilings drowned out the carnival music. He stepped out from behind a souvenir kiosk, his shadow falling over her. "Sarah," he said. She gasped, dropping her briefcase. The latch popped open, spilling a stack of folders and a small, silver burner phone onto the wood planks. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a terror that looked like a physical blow. "Julian? You're supposed to be in the facility," she stammered, her voice a thin, brittle reed. "The facility was a bit too permanent for my taste," Julian said, stepping closer. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she could smell the junkyard on his clothes. "Why, Sarah? Was the payout that good? Or did Marcus just promise not to delete you too?" Sarah began to cry, the sound lost in the wind. "He told me it was a reorganization. He said you were going to jail anyway for the embezzlement. He said I was the only one he could trust to clean it up. But then the men started following me. I realized I'm just the next glitch he needs to fix. Give me the proof, Sarah. Give me the access codes to the cloud server. I can restore the backups. I can prove I'm alive." She reached down and picked up the burner phone, her hands shaking so hard she almost dropped it again. "It's all in here. I recorded him. The meetings, the bribes to the judge, the orders to the transport team. He's closing the Hellgate deal in an hour, Julian. Once the money moves through the offshore accounts, the company is a shell. There won't be anything left to reclaim." Julian reached for the phone. "Give it to me. Subverted beat 3.2. Julian's fingers closed around the cool metallic casing of the burner phone. He felt a sudden, sharp surge of relief that made his knees weak. This was it. The silver bullet. with Sarah's recorded confession and the metadata on this device. No amount of corporate influence could keep him dead. He could walk into any federal building, hand this over, and watch the walls of Marcus's empire crumble. "You're doing the right thing, Sarah," Julian said, his voice softening. He actually smiled, a genuine human expression he hadn't felt in days. "I'll make sure you're protected. We'll go to the FBI. They have safe houses. Marcus can't reach you there." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked relieved, her shoulders dropping for the first time. "I just want it to be over, Julian. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "It is over," Julian said. He tucked the phone into his inner jacket pocket, patting it twice. "Let's get off this pier." He turned to lead her toward the street, his mind already mapping out the route to the Federal Plaza. He felt a sense of competence, a victory. He had outsmarted them. He had survived the hitman, the city, and the law. But then, he heard it. The sound of a heavy hand clapping, not in applause, but the slow, rhythmic strike of palm against palm. Clap, clap, clap. Julian froze. He turned back. Marcus Thorne stepped out from behind a cluster of decorative planters, flanked by 4 men in tactical gear. He wasn't wearing his usual suit. He was in a dark, expensive trench coat, his pale blue eyes gleaming in the neon light of the Ferris wheel. "It was a beautiful performance, Julian. Truly," Marcus said, his voice a slow, predatory crawl. "The hero and the repentant sinner. It almost makes me want to cry. Don't we think so, boys?" Julian reached for the phone, but one of the guards was already moving, his hand on his holster. "Don't," Marcus warned, his voice dropping an octave. "I've had this pier locked down for 20 minutes. Every exit is blocked. Every camera is ours. You didn't find Sarah, Julian. I sent her to you. I needed to know if you'd actually show up, or if you were just going to keep running like a smart little rat." Julian looked at Sarah. She wasn't crying anymore. She was standing behind Marcus's guards, her face blank and hollow. "Sarah," Julian whispered. "She's a very good actress, isn't she?" Marcus said, stepping closer. He reached out and rested a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder, his thumb pressing into the collarbone. "She didn't record a confession, Julian. She recorded you admitting to the theft of company secrets and the harassment of a government official. That phone in your pocket? It's not evidence of my crimes. It's the final nail in your coffin." Julian felt the world tilt. The relief he'd felt moments ago turned into a cold, sickening dread. He hadn't won. He'd walked directly into the center of the web, and he'd brought the evidence of his own insanity with him. "Now," Marcus said, his smile widening, "be a good lad and give me my phone back. We have a show to start, and you're the guest of honor." Julian backed away, his heels hitting the edge of the pier. Behind him, the mirror maze of the Funhouse attraction loomed, a building made of glass and deception. He didn't think. He dove through the entrance, the heavy velvet curtains swallowing him whole as the guards' shouts echoed across the water. The mirror maze was a nightmare of infinite reflections. Julian ran, his hands hitting cold, hard glass at every turn. He saw 100 Julians, bloody, tattered, and panicked, running alongside him. The scent of ozone and popcorn hung in the air, a surreal contrast to the life-and-death struggle unfolding in the glass box. "Spread out," Marcus's voice boomed, distorted by the acoustics of the maze. "He's a ghost. Let's see if he can bleed like one." Julian slowed his breathing, pressing his back against a mirror. He looked at the floor. The carpet was worn in certain areas, showing the path most tourists took. He moved in the opposite direction, stepping over the brass floor dividers. He saw a guard's reflection in a panel to his left. The man was confused, his hand outstretched, touching his own image. Julian didn't use a gun. He used the environment. He waited until the guard turned his back, then lunged. He grabbed the man's head and slammed it into the glass. The mirror didn't shatter. It was reinforced. But the impact was enough to drop the man in a heap. Julian took the guard's radio and threw it into a far corner of the maze. "He's in Section C," the radio chirped, leading the other guards away from Julian's actual position. He moved like a shadow through the glass forest. He found a second guard, then a third, using the disorienting reflections to strike from the blind side. He was the ghost in the machine now, and the machine was made of mirrors. But as he reached the exit, a heavy hand clamped onto his throat. Marcus Thorne wasn't a soldier, but he was a predator. He had found the one path Julian hadn't covered. He slammed Julian against a mirror, the glass vibrating behind his head. "You think you're so smart," Marcus hissed, his face inches from Julian's. He smelled of expensive scotch and rot. "But you're just a glitch, and I'm the debugger." Marcus pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a psychiatric committal form, signed by a judge and a state doctor. "You're not a criminal, Julian. You're a danger to yourself and others. A delusional vagrant who thinks he's a dead billionaire. You have no civil rights, no right to an attorney, no right to be heard. You're just gone." Julian struggled, his fingers clawing at Marcus's wrists. They drifted toward the edge of the maze, a balcony that overlooked the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan. The wind howled, spraying them with cold, stinging mist. "The phone, Julian," Marcus demanded, his hand tightening on Julian's throat. "Give it to me, or I'll skip the facility and just let the lake handle the paperwork." Julian reached into his pocket. He pulled out the burner phone. His hand was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer physical strain of the struggle. "You want it?" Julian gasped. He didn't hand it over. He threw it. The silver phone arched through the air, a tiny, glinting spark against the black backdrop of the lake. Marcus let go of Julian's throat, his hands reaching out in a futile gesture of greed. Splash. The sound was small, definitive. The phone, the evidence, the lie, it all disappeared into the depths of the water. Marcus turned back to Julian, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He raised his fist, but the sound of sirens, real, heavy-duty police sirens, erupted from the street below. Blue and red lights bathed the pier in a rhythmic, frantic pulse. Marcus smoothed his trench coat, his expression shifting instantly back to one of concerned authority. "Take him," Marcus said to the officers who burst onto the balcony. "He's the one. He tried to jump. I was just trying to save him." The police didn't ask questions. They saw a man in a tattered suit, bleeding and wild-eyed, and a respected CEO standing over him. They forced Julian into a straitjacket, the heavy canvas binding his arms to his chest. "I'm Julian Sterling," Julian screamed, but the wind swallowed his words. "Check the records. Look at his hands." Marcus watched as they hauled Julian toward the transport van. He leaned in one last time, whispering so only Julian could hear. "The ledger says you're dead, Julian, and the ledger never lies." The transport van didn't have windows. It was a tomb on wheels, smelling of stale air and the chemical scent of the sedative they'd injected into Julian's shoulder. His mind was a blur, a series of flashing images. Linda's cold eyes, the splash of the phone, the rhythmic tap of Michael Davis's finger. The van slowed down. The smooth hum of the highway was replaced by the crunch of gravel. Julian felt the vehicle tilt as it navigated a steep, uneven path. The doors opened. He wasn't at a psychiatric facility. He was in a clearing in a dense, dark forest. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. The cicadas were screaming, a high-pitched drone that felt like a drill in his ears. Two men, the officers from the pier, who were actually Marcus's private contractors, pulled him out of the van. They had removed their badges. One of them, a man named Christopher Brown, was polishing his thumb against a lucky sock he'd pulled from his vest. "Nice spot, isn't it?" Christopher said, his voice devoid of empathy. "We are going to exterminate your residency. It's very quiet out here. No one to hear the suicide note." They dragged Julian toward a pre-dug hole in the dirt. It was shallow, smelling of raw earth and decay. Julian felt the cold metal of a pistol barrel press against the back of his neck. This was the end. Rock bottom. He was a dead man standing over his own grave. But Julian Sterling was a man of patterns, and he knew this van. It was a Thorn Industries secure trans model, a vehicle he had helped design for high-value asset relocation. He knew there was a mechanical flaw, a legacy override from the original prototype. He kicked back with all his strength, his heel hitting a small, recessed lever near the rear wheel well. It was the emergency pressure release for the hydraulic system. There was a violent hiss of escaping air. The back doors of the van swung outward with the force of a battering ram, catching Christopher Brown in the chest. The man flew backward, his pistol firing harmlessly into the trees. Julian didn't wait. He dove into the thick undergrowth, the straitjacket making him look like a white ghost darting through the shadows. He ran blindly, feeling the branches tear at his face, until he found a hollowed-out log near a stream. He crawled inside, his heart thundering, and waited. He waited for an hour, then 2. When the sounds of the search died down, he used a sharp piece of flint from the stream bed to saw through the canvas of the straitjacket. It took hours, his fingers bleeding and numb. But finally, the restraints fell away. He reached into his hidden pocket. He still had it. The encrypted key card. He didn't go to the police. He didn't go to the FBI. He went to a public locker at a bus station on the outskirts of the city, where he had hidden a small, hand-built transmitter weeks ago as a black box contingency. He plugged the key card into the transmitter. He didn't send a message. He sent a signal, a high-frequency distress zero alert that was hardwired into the federal smart city backbone. It was a signal that could only be triggered by a deceased executive credential. It was a digital flare ship. It bypassed the local servers, bypassed Marcus's influence, and went straight to the Federal Oversight Bureau in D.C. It was a system error, so massive it required a mandatory, boots-on-the-ground investigation. The federal hearing room was a cathedral of dark wood and stifling silence. The air was heavy, the hum of the ventilation system creating a pressure in Julian's ears that made the world feel small. Julian sat at the witness table, his suit new, but his face still bearing the scars of the junkyard and the woods. Across the aisle sat Marcus Thorne, Robert Hayes, and Linda Sterling. They looked like a portrait of American success, but their eyes were the eyes of people watching a ghost speak. Julian presented the key card. He didn't talk about his feelings. He talked about data. He showed the court the digital breadcrumbs, the forged signatures, the offshore transfers triggered by his death, the logs of the smart city surveillance that had been used to hunt him. "The system didn't fail," Julian said, his voice calm and resonant. "The system was used as a weapon. I designed the lock, and Marcus Thorne stole the key. But a lock only works if you don't know the back door." He played the final piece of evidence. It wasn't Sarah's confession. It was a recording from the van's internal black box, a recording of Christopher Brown discussing the execution orders Marcus had given him. The room was silent. Then, the sound of a gavel hitting the bench, thud, 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 echoed like a heartbeat. The court finds the death certificate of Julian Sterling to be a fraudulent instrument. Judge Rebecca Thompson said, her voice iron cold. The identity of the subject is hereby restored. Federal marshals, take the defendants into custody. Julian watched as they led Marcus away. Marcus didn't shout. He didn't struggle. He just looked at Julian, his pale blue eyes finally showing a flicker of the vacuum inside. Linda looked at the floor, her hands trembling as she tried to remove the greenless emerald ring Marcus had given her. Julian walked out of the courthouse and into the bright Chicago sun. He sat on a bench in the park, watching the people go by. He was legally alive. He had his money back, his name back, his life back. But as he looked at his reflection in a nearby fountain, he didn't see the mogul. He saw a man who had been erased and had to draw himself back into existence. He reached into his pocket and felt the small piece of server blade. He didn't rub it. He let it go, dropping it into the water, watching it sink to the bottom. He stood up and started walking. Not toward his penthouse, not toward his office. He walked toward the horizon, a man who was no longer a ghost, but was finally, for the first time, real.